And let's talk about the evidence. So we're talking about the bloody sock. The thing I find interesting about the bloody sock. So I'm gonna change, not change, but I'm gonna update my view here. So the one thing that I could see happening here is this is Darren's sock. This is Darren's tube sock.
Right.
And I heard somebody mention this, and this really makes sense to me. This sock, forgetting how it got there, was used to move evidence around because it looks like somebody put their hand in it, and there's finger marks here as if they were holding something in the sock to not get fingerprints on a knife or something to that effect.
Sure.
And how it got out here is another question. But for me, the sock, to think that Darlie had any opportunity to put that there. Did you hear about the timeline that one of the investigators for Darlie Routier put together for when, and this was a doctor as well. I think I actually have a statement from him. But
right.
Did you
well,
hear
it has
about
to do with the death of the son, right? And he had
Vincent DeMaio, the chief medical examiner in San Antonio and editor-in-chief of the prestigious Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology, testified that her injuries. Wrong thing. I'm an asshole. Records indicate that Darlie was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher for 5 minutes and 44 seconds. Just as that call was ending, a police officer came inside the house, and he was there for at least a minute before the paramedics arrived. The paramedics found Damon still breathing. He died shortly thereafter. Why is that important? According to a doctor who studied the severity and location of Damon's stab wounds, the boy could not have lived longer than 9 minutes once he was first stabbed, and probably lived no more than 6 minutes. Let's assume he lived 9. If you subtract that 9 minutes from her 5-minute 44-second phone call to 911, then subtract the additional minute and 10 seconds that she was in the presence of the police officer, Darlie had only 2 minutes and 6 seconds to stab her sons, head for the garage, step through the slit in the window screen, jump a back fence or go through the back gate, run barefoot for 75 yards down an alley, drop a bloody sock, run 75 yards back, stab herself, clean up the blood around the sink, and that was another thing we'll talk about in a bit, and stage whatever crime scene there was left to be staged, boy's blood on the back of the nightgown. So for me, that's not quite disqualifying, but it's close to disqualifying Darlie from putting that sock there. And we have to ask, how did that sock get there?
Sure. And I mean, the sock definitely presents a problem. It was clever if Darlie did it. It was diabolical if Darren did it. And if there was an intruder, it's a little odd because here's an intruder who shows up not to rob, clearly, wants to murder at least somebody, but doesn't bring anything for that purpose. And you're thinking, well, okay, let's say he is there to rob. Let's say he's there to break in and steal stuff. And then he realizes, oh, crap, there's all these people here, and I'm going to get caught, so I have no choice but to murder the lot of them. Does he think about the socks? He's grabbing the knife. Is that just a panic move? You just grab the knife and start stabbing? Why would he also think about the sock? I mean, it doesn't really fit with an intruder at all. I don't think, that
No.
you bring, so it's got to be Darlie or Darren who planted that sock. So now you're down to, well, which one of them was it? And although I agree the timeline is tight, that narrative that was just laid out, I think is a little goofy in that I don't see why she certainly, if we're assuming that she's responsible, she cut the hole in the screen. Why would you assume she actually used it? She'd probably just use the door. You know what I mean? Like that's just a staging item. Yeah.
She's not she's not an intelligent individual. I think she's gotten a bit street smart in her older age. If you listen to interviews more recently, but when you listen to her in interviews, she's not a bright young person. She's not somebody who's very world wise, and to be able, like you said, diabolical would be the word to use if she was able to pull that off. And one of the things that jumped out to my wife when she was watching the Werner Herzog documentary, the first responder who wasn't supposed to be there, he was in the area, noted that Darren was running out of the house. So, was this his second run out for whatever reason? Why was he leaving the house? So that there was an element where he was seen outside of the house at one point. I'm not saying that was him coming back. He wasn't coming back. He was coming out of the house. But while she was on the phone, he was in and out.
I mean, running out to meet the paramedics who are coming to get your children.
They weren't there yet.
I know, but like you've called, you're waiting. running outside to see, are they here? Because you've determined there isn't anything you can do. Like, I don't know, that strikes me as within the realm
it
of
is
what I would
completely
do.
within. But we have to ask how the sock got there, and if we're putting this solely on Darlie, and that timeline has to be met by somebody who is not a mental titan. We then have to start to ask the question, how does that get there? And for me, this is where we start to disqualify death penalty Darlie, when we start looking at the evidence out there that sort of discounts her as being a sole actor in this.
But I mean, the problem I have with any Darren is involved theory is the possibility that Darren is solely involved strikes me as minimal, de minimis, just because of the fact that Darlie made the call and Darlie didn't identify him. And it would require him, as I said in the last segment, to change, if he's responsible for this, first of all, why would he kill his children? Wouldn't he kill his wife? And the same question that Darlie's defense asks on behalf of Darlie, if she's after insurance money, why wouldn't she kill her husband and for the $800,000 instead of her 2 children for 10?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask the same question for Darren. Like, if he's after insurance money, why not kill the wife for the $250 instead of 2 kids for 10? So I don't see his motive here. And then, I certainly do see him. You're right, but he attacks her, but in a comparatively speaking, haphazard, half-assed way, gets caught in the middle of it. If you believe that he's the sole person, is the luckiest SOB that she, in waking up and being alert enough eventually to pick up the phone and call 911, not recognize that it was her husband who was in fact attacking her, and that he somehow has either a house that permits it or just real stealthy way about him that he can not only re-enter the house, but apparently get back upstairs and then appear to come down the stairs. Although maybe that's a bit much because maybe Darlie doesn't really know from which direction he came. I don't know. It seems to me to be very, very unlikely. So you're down to, well, Darlie and Darren work together. But if that's the case, again, why hasn't Darlie rolled on Darren?
Well, and this is, and I agree with this because one of the theories, and this isn't my number one theory, but one of the theories that I looked at quite closely was having another actor in there, because again, Darren had motive, and you could convince somebody to help you kill your wife for $100,000
money. Yeah, sure.
Split the insurance money, and it's, if that person got away, Darren's not going to rat out his mate, because his mate was quite happy to murder his wife. What's to say he isn't going to come back and murder him?
True.
But there's reason to think that there was somebody else involved in that, and that's something that wasn't looked at. And I think there was evidence in the case that there was multiple people. There's somebody who lived about a block away, or was about a block and a half away, who reported somebody in all black trying to get into the house. Now, it was also notable, and I didn't mention this earlier, that the drive, he was having problems with his Jaguar, his car. And the drive had no cars on it. So it looked like the house was empty when somebody entered. So it is feasible that the person who tried to break into the house, and the police took the statement, they took the evidence, and they didn't follow it up. But there was somebody a couple blocks away breaking in at about the time, or about 10 minutes or a half hour before somebody broke into Darlie Routier's house. There was also people that reported a strange car hovering around the area as well, even pulling up in front of the Routier residence. And that wasn't really looked into any further. So there's, again, more evidence to say there's not more evidence to say Darlie didn't do it, but there's more evidence to say that this is bigger than just a wife, a mother turning on her children and going batshit crazy.
Right.
Somebody who had no priors, somebody who had no notable mental health conditions outside of depression, which we'll go into that in a bit more.
Well, I mean, if we're analyzing evidence, I'll say that the 2 pieces of evidence that I find most compelling in opposite directions, really the sock. I think that the sock is anything. If anything, it points to somebody in the house, but it's not the be all end all, right? It could go either way. What I find the 2 most compelling are, and certainly what I think sank her battleship with the prosecution and a trial, was that on one of the other knives in the kitchen, they found traces of the screen that had been cut out.
Yeah.
Now, that's there isn't a good explanation for that other than somebody in that house did that.
There was a forensics expert who did say, so this is somebody working on the appellate team, who said that same material was used, that same compounds. So what the investigator said. Now, this is something that would have to be submitted to evidence, and I'm not saying that this is 100% accurate, but they had a forensic expert who said that the material used on the fingerprint brushes is identical to the same material on the screen. And the material they found that matched the compound on the screen was the width of a hair or the width of a brush. And they found this material after it had already been brushed for fingerprints. So you could arguably have somebody from the defense team say, okay, is it feasible that this is also from the fingerprint brush? If the answer is yes, then that brings into question that evidence of the screen.
Well, that's good. I hadn't heard that. That's interesting. I hadn't read that.
The one that Darlie's mother has one point, which I don't buy. It was a butter knife, and I don't have a picture of the knife, but it was a rounded end. It was a big bread knife, I guess. I don't know why she calls it a butter knife. They had money, so maybe rich people have different butter knives than I do. But it was a big rounded. It had a rounded edge, and she said you couldn't get that knife into the screen. And I grew up in the States, and I've put my fair share of things through screens, and you can get pretty much anything through a screen if you push.
Oh yeah.
With an edge, but that was her reason. So there was the ability, and there is the ability currently to counter, the material that it isn't necessarily from the screen.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't find as compelling, although I don't think is easily dismissible either. The fact that the area around the screen that was cut out, that was supposedly the point of entry and exit for this intruder, the window still underneath it the dust wasn't disturbed. The mulch outside that window there was no footprint or any sign of disturbing. You know what I mean? Like the entry in, entry out point. I don't think that's I don't know if that would put it over a reasonable doubt threshold for me, but it makes me go, in terms of whether or not someone actually did use that point as a way in or out of that house that day.
I didn't get a picture. I have a picture that I can bring up because that was something I thought about, but Darren, I saw a video of Darren actually showing the window, and it was weird that the police said that there was no footprints, therefore it's not possible. If you look at a picture of the window, it's actually really hard to make a footprint in the dirt because the concrete is under the window, and it's very easy to step in and step out. And he demonstrated it. It would actually be difficult because the windowsill was only this high off the ground, and it was almost like a 5 foot tall window,
right?
About 3.5 feet wide. And he had the window open, and he said it was easier just to step in and out without touching anything, without disturbing anything.
Sure,
so there was concrete under that. I thought I had a picture. Let me just try to.
Also, I thought there was an unidentified fingerprint actually found in that windowsill.
So that let me share this one with you so you can see the window here. So this is the window in question.
I've seen this window.
Yeah, the fingerprint. That was the other thing that I read about, which that was interesting because this is something that's being contended, and what the prosecution says, rightfully, what Greg Davis will say is they're making these claims about a fingerprint, but they haven't produced this evidence, and they've had this fingerprint for years. Now they've had forensic experts that have said this fingerprint, they've had 3 forensic experts who have now said, might have been 3 or 4, that this fingerprint can be matched. There's enough data points to match it. However, and none of those prints match Darlie, Damon, Devon, or Darren, all the D's.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that. Ooh, that's awful. Why would you do that? And with that inability to match them, they've not been given permission to run that print or those 6 points that they've been able to get through the national database. So they're still trying to get that fingerprint cross-reference. I don't know if that's changed. I don't think it has. I find it interesting that they haven't been able to at least check that fingerprint.
Yeah, I mean, I would turn that over immediately if I thought I had something, right? So that is sort of an interesting. If it's so exculpatory, why haven't you turned it over?
Yeah. What I find interesting, which I think is compelling, is the sink. So I don't know if you're familiar with the sink, what was going on with the sink.
Refresh the memory of myself and the audience.
When they came back in, the sink.
Because I'm going to blame the audience for my lack of knowledge. It's the audience you're telling, Sean, not me.
That's right. So audience, when a chemical luminol was sprayed around the kitchen to reveal traces of blood not visible to the naked eye, blood stains were discovered in the sink, the kind that would be consistent with someone washing blood off his or her hands. There was also an indication that some of Darlie's blood around the sink had been wiped up with a towel. So there's you start getting back into that cover up piece. And there was another piece of evidence that kind of went towards there was a cover up in the house. And that had to do with the wine glass. Now, the wine glass, there was a few points with the wine glass, one of which they were talking about the wine glass being on top of the blood, but the wine glass not having blood on it. So it's feasible that somebody in knocked it on the floor when they were coming in and out of the scene to take care of the kids or whatever. But one of the things they said was it was knocked on the floor. And the way this wine rack is set up, it's not easy to knock. I think you have to actually unclasp it up here and pull it out. So you can't just knock wine out of that wine glass out of that rack. So you would have had to have physically grabbed it and thrown it on the floor, which the whole idea that there was a piece of glass on the floor that wasn't prompted by any sort of scuffle or anything like that is weird. And to me, it looks like there's some sort of a cover up there.
Yeah. Yeah. And the wine glass bothers me. The sink actually bothers me quite a bit as well, because there isn't any good reason, especially once again, the problem is that she gave enough of a story. That's always the problem with giving a story, is that now you have some things that are points of verification. Yeah. Her story makes it clear that he exited the house without attempting a cleanup. So there shouldn't have been any blood in the sink.
Yeah. I'm just going to go through some of the other evidence here in case some of the audience has heard and some of the audience hasn't heard.
I know the one that I think is the most important for her, not so much for her innocence, but the one that I question the most. Go on.
Well, let's go to the list here. I have the bruising on her arms.
Yes. Which I think that helps her.
Well, this is actually the biggest part of contention that may hurt her, because every medical expert who saw her on the day, everyone testified that they had no markings and no bruising on her arms. And the picture that we're looking at, so let me bring up the original picture here so we can look at it in context. It is understood by the medical professionals who treated her that this would have happened after her visit to the hospital. So this bruising, how deep this blood collection is, you would have seen evidence of this. And all the nurses and doctors who saw her at the hospital, they said that they would have seen some evidence of something, and there was nothing there. They documented nothing. So the medical experts who saw her believe this happened after she was in the hospital.
Oh, who took these pictures? I always I saw them and I took them at face value. Silly me.
So the photos were taken after she returned from the hospital, and the only people who have ever maintained that this happened on the night were her family and friends. Who
took the photos?
I think that it looks like the police took them after the fact, because she was arrested after the fact, so she would have had these bruised arms. I'm not 100% because it looks like this is state's exhibit, so this is evidence. So this may have been taken after the fact, and bruising like that would take a good week to go to minimize. I mean, that's
at least that's
hideous. Yeah. So that's something that actually goes against her in my view. That bruising showing up after the fact and her showing that bruising off.
When did she have the opportunity? I mean, because that kind of bruising is not easy to produce.
Well, she was home on her own. Not on her own, but she once she left the hospital, she wasn't arrested until. Well, it would have been at least 8 days after 8. It was she got arrested the day after the silly string
event. So it's 9 days later, right?
So 9 days later. So she had plenty of time to.
She's being surveilled, though, probably during that time. Yeah, but I guess she's home alone. Yeah, she's inside the house.
Let's look at it this way. This puts into context the injury she sustained. And there's a few different things. So let's take a look at the injuries, because there's a few different things on these injuries here that are of note that I read about. And I actually have some comments from the medical examiner about this. Let me just see here. Where is it? So few points here. So Vincent DeMaio, the chief medical examiner in San Antonio, so this is what I was reading earlier like an idiot, testified that her injuries were not at all consistent with self-inflicted wounds we had seen in the past. So this isn't the medical professionals who had seen her. And he said the cut across her throat was hardly superficial. Now, that being said, the cut across her throat, the people that treated her said that, yeah, it was a couple millimeters from her artery, but it was only it wasn't that deep. It was only like a half an inch deep. They also talked about this cut here. They said it wasn't a stab. It was more of a laceration, almost as if somebody just broke the skin, and it was not very deep. The only one that was deep was the one on her forearm that was down to the bone. But if you think about where your bone is here,
it's not that deep.
Not that deep. And it would have been hard to stab her in the forearm, not that deep. And the reason I bring this up is this is interesting in comparison to this photo, if we can prove that that is after the fact. So if she's willing to do this to herself, she sure as shit would be willing to do this to herself or with somebody's help. So to me, that paints an interesting picture.
It does. And I apologize that I did not know this about that. I always just saw those photos of the, and when I was researching, I never really questioned or thought to look into those, the bruised arm photos. So I've learned something here. I just assumed that those were police photos and were, part of their investigation really that night. Or, well, maybe not that night, because obviously she went to the hospital first, but, photos taken in the aftermath. And of course, bruising does take a little bit to develop. So you wouldn't necessarily expect, like, that bruising looks like it's a little bit old, in the sense that it wouldn't have been something that would have developed in the first 30 seconds. You know what I mean? Like, I got blood drawn, for example, on the weekend or on Monday. And today I noticed I have some bruising around it, but it wasn't there even Wednesday or Thursday.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it because the so I'm just going to find it here. Where is it? There was every single across the board. I think one of the conclusions. So that woman on Unsolved Mysteries, I think her name was Barbara Davis. I actually found there's a website you can look up, Darlie Routier Fact and Fiction. She spent a lot of time researching this. No, it's not on here. But one of the things that she did come up with was, every medical professional that saw her said, now this is something I have to go with what those medical professionals said. That level of bruising, there would be some sort of welts or redness or some sort of indication. So if you think about when you get in a fight and you get a black eye.
Right.
So I think what they said was the bruising would have been consistent, would have shown up within 24 hours, and she was in the hospital I think the first 2 days, and they said we would have seen signs of it before she left the hospital.
That makes sense.
So it's something that is arguable, but that's one of the points. And there isn't much else in the way of evidence. Is there anything else? Well,
that's the big one. I guess maybe it's maybe become, maybe something that's no longer really part of the prosecution's narrative, but one big part of the prosecution's narrative at trial, surely was this Tom Bevel character. Have you read about this?
Yeah, actually. Let me just find it, because
he's the one who testified, and Tom Bevel is one of these cast-off study people, blood cast-off and cast-off, right? And he was somebody who famously ran around testifying against all kinds of people and, studying the blood cast-off and using, looking into the sheep's bladders and divining what happened from blood cast-off. And he said there was, even like, it's great. I wish I had it here. The Unsolved Mysteries segment shows you the single spot of blood and it was, I think, an admixture of the two children on the back shoulder, sort of behind. And his contention was that's from, you're making a downward stabbing motion, you're pulling the knife back, and a blood drop hits you right here, and that's that cast off, right? So that the problem is that this Tom Bevel guy has subsequently been thoroughly embarrassed and debunked as somebody who has made a number of overinterpreted. I don't even know that he was doing it. I haven't looked into it enough to know what was he truly like, malevolent? Was he outright lying, or is he just, testifying more aggressively than his actual expertise warranted? But like, there was an example of a case where he testified that somebody's cast off blood in another case was, this is clear-cut evidence that so-and-so did this thing. And in fact, that person was later exonerated, not just, not on a technicality, exonerated by DNA evidence. So, and in general, blood cast off, there's a great article out there about cast off, because if you watch a lot of forensic files, it comes up so frequently, the blood cast off analysis, blood spatter analysis, that's what it's really called. Blood spatter analysis is used to determine angles and velocities and where someone was standing when this, that, or the other thing happened. And a lot of that so-called science turns out not to be science. And in fact, is really questionable. And so it's now starting to, be questioned. The article is called "How a Dubious Forensic Science Spread Like a Virus." For those looking for you, those of you trying to find the article I'm referring to on Google, Herbert McDonald. Donald is not the author, but he's somebody he's the guy who launched modern bloodstain pattern analysis, persuading judge after judge of its reliability. He trained lots of people, and this article was published December 13th, 2018 by a woman named Leora Smith. So good job, Leora. But that's science that could be close to junk science. You know what I mean? It's like bite mark analysis also has really come into some significant scrutiny. So in terms of like their prosecution's presentation, they're basically presenting the idea that this blood from Darren and from not Darren, I'm sorry, Devon and from Damon winding up on the back of her shirt where it did is practically, the damning in and of itself. Like, how else could it get there?
Yeah. And
the answer to that is, first of all, if she's being stabbed with the same knife by someone else, easily, you know what I mean? I would think would be the answer,
It reeks of something, and it does. It just reeks of somebody who's like just sort of making it up as they go.
Yeah.
The blood evidence was quite important. And I think the thing they took away from the blood evidence was they didn't find anybody else's blood on the scene, which again goes back to every time I see a stabbing to the degree that these children were stabbed. I mean, it was forceful. There was no blood evidence from anybody else. The one thing that I'm not sure how to take, if she was cut to the across the throat, and so there's another sort of contradiction here, but if she was cut in the throat and stabbed as she was, there was little to no blood on the sofa, and that's what this is. This is the sofa that she was laying on when she says she was attacked. There was only a couple of droplets on the pillow. There wasn't much in the way of any blood, and I actually have the pillow as well. And I think these are the spots of blood for somebody who was laying down on their back and attacked, had their throat cut, stabbed arm. It makes me ask questions. Why isn't there more blood on the sofa for somebody who's been attacked, to the degree that she was attacked? And that kind of doubles back to the fact that the medical professionals who looked at it actually weren't as damning about the injuries as, let's say, the family and some of the Darlie's experts. They were saying that actually a lot of these wounds are surface wounds. Even though it was 2 millimeters from the artery, it doesn't mean that it was a particularly deep wound. So it doesn't necessarily tell the story of somebody who was aggressively attacked and there was an attempted murder there. Right. But it is very much Keystone Cops. And what I find disappointing in all of this isn't so much how poor the prosecution was, but how poor the defense was, and how, when we take a look at witnesses, they didn't put a lot of witnesses up to contend the experts of the state. And the jury themselves, one of the jurors said, we really didn't get anybody telling us, that this information we were getting was wrong. The state was saying, here's our expert and here's why it proves Darlie did it. They never put anybody up to the stand because the defense thought, oh, this is circumstantial. Texas isn't going to fry somebody on circumstantial evidence. Really hasn't lived in Texas long enough.
They'll fry as soon as look at you there.
So the evidence in itself, it's weird. There's not a lot of evidence, and that really sort of points into a very specific direction. If anything, it highlights the fact that the police didn't really do a very thorough job in coming to the conclusions that they came to. Would you agree with that?
Well, you're being very critical of the police here. I don't know that I do entirely, in that, I mean, they collected what was there. I'm not sure what else they were supposed to have. I mean, they interpreted the evidence one way. Now, you can say that they had tunnel vision, but, sometimes you have tunnel vision because it's obvious who did it from the word go, O.J. Simpson. And so, you know what I mean? Like, sometimes the tunnel vision is there for very good reason. Now, I don't know if that's the case in this case, and I think we'll talk about that in our next segment. But, I mean, part of what my understanding is, part of the police's initial suspicion of Darlie's entire story was that there's all this blood all over the place in the living room and the kitchen. It's a very, very bloody scene. Obviously, I mean, people are being stabbed with a knife, so of course. And yet she says that the guy escapes through the garage, and there was no real blood evidence of any significant value in that garage, any trail leading away from the house through the garage. And that was problematic for them. Now, I have this feeling, again, I'm not a professional crime investigator, so I'm speaking from ignorance here, but I don't know if I'm an outside perpetrator and I've stabbed a bunch of people and now I'm fleeing the scene and I've dropped the weapon. I don't know how much of a blood trail I would necessarily leave. Like, I don't know. I mean, like, it seems to me like they're arguing from absence there. In other words, that the absence of evidence is evidence. And I'm always suspicious of that argument. Having said that, I understand why it certainly raised red flags. And I think the preponderance of the evidence, and this is Darlie's problem, is that other than her claim that someone broke in, there really isn't much evidence that there was anyone else there. Now, there are these couple of fingerprint issues, but again, the fingerprints have not been submitted. They exist because Darlie's family says they exist, but until there's something more concrete than that, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, and that's problematic. I do think though, and why don't we let's move on from the evidence section here, and to everybody watching, this is the end of part 2. Again, if you want to watch us live, watch us on Twitter and Twitch, and as far as to watch the whole broadcast, and we'll be releasing part 3, which after the evidence bit, part 3 will be our review and verdict on what we think happened and our verdict on the case itself.